Chapter 40. Jackson Says Goodbye. Jack watched Jamie and Toothless disappear into the darkness before he took a steadying breath and turned to Hiccup. "Let's go," he said, and started walking. Hiccup looked like, if there had been a table nearby, he would have flipped it, at least given it a passionate attempt.
"Go where?" he demanded. "Jack, what is going on with you?"
Jack bit his lip. He stared at his bare feet for a few moments, trying his best to meet Hiccup's eyes, but for some reason it was extremely challenging. He touched the mark on his face. "I can feel her power building up somewhere on this island," he said. "She'll be here. That's what... the one I talked to said."
"And who was that?"
Hiccup asked. Jack glanced at him, then quickly looked ahead again. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said with a nervous laugh.
Oh, we're there again, are we?"
Hiccup suddenly grabbed his arm, turning him around to face him. His green eyes blazed.
"Jack, answers. You promised."
For a moment, it felt as if baby-toothed magic was failing, because Jack promptly forgot how to construct a proper Norse sentence. He swallowed. "Do you notice anything different about me?" he asked. Hiccup stared at him. His eyes went down to his feet, then to his staff, and then tentatively back to his eyes.
"Which song did we sing together?"
he suddenly asked back, his voice quiet. Jack raised his brows. "Do you seriously think the Snow Queen would have thought it a clever tactic to ask, 'Do you notice anything different about me?' if I were one of her puppets?"
"I'm almost entirely sure you're you, because the Snow Queen wouldn't know about your weird grudge against footwear," Hiccup said. "But it would still calm me down if you answered the question."
Jack's heart felt more like it was vibrating than beating. "Not the settling kind," he answered. He tried fighting the smile creeping onto his lips, but it was futile. "I'd love to hear it again when we're done with this. And you didn't answer my question. Come on." He nodded for them to start walking again. The ground sloped upwards.
"Well,"
Hiccup said, gesturing exasperatedly at nothing in particular,
"you definitely don't seem to be on the brink of death anymore. A good change, it's not that, but I'm just a tiny bit worried about how you achieved it."
"I told you," Jack said, ignoring the faint pang of disappointment in his chest. "I got help. Anything else, though?" Hiccup sent him a weird look.
You,
he started uncertainly.
"You seem nervous."
Jack smiled wryly. "I am nervous," he agreed. Hiccup was quiet, waiting for him to continue. Jack tightened his grip around his staff. "I met one of your gods," he said. "A goddess." Evidently, this was not what Hiccup expected to hear. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Before he had the chance to ask which goddess, Jack continued. "She wasn't what I hoped she would be," he said quietly. "I hoped she'd be powerful, but she said this was something I had to do myself. All she could do was help me on my way. And she did. I sacrificed the shoes. Sorry, please don't ask. Which gave her enough magic to power the crystal and get my staff back. The gods were the ones who brought me here. They left one of the crystals with us so that we'd have a chance to find our way back home."
"So you were right," Hiccup said. "The crystals will take you home, but how? I never understood what it is you see in there. What happened just now between you and Jamie?"
Jack couldn't help but smile. "Turns out we're related after all," he said. "Distantly, but still." Hiccup's brows knitted together.
"I mean, that's the least surprising thing you've told me thus far, but how do you know what you see is true?"
"Because the visions are scenes from our lives. Mostly, anyway. They're not just conjured from our imaginations. They move us through time. Through important moments." He glanced at Hiccup, wondering if that was enough to clue him in on the whole time-traveling thing. But Hiccup was no longer paying attention, his eyes fixed on something ahead of them. Jack followed his gaze. They'd come to the peak of a hill. Below them was a valley, surrounded by tall white cliffs and dotted with patches of forest. Above them, it looked as if a tornado were about to form, the silvery clouds swirling languidly. Even without the Snow Queen's mark, and even without Hiccup's special ability to recognize the hum of magic, anyone could tell this was the spot the Snow Queen had decided to bring about their last showdown. "She's here," Jack whispered. "She's trying to intimidate us."
"She's doing a good job,"
Hiccup murmured back. "Hiccup." Jack turned to him, but again the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. He took a shaky breath. The goddess, she made me understand how to defeat the Snow Queen, but I have to do it alone. Hiccup's eyes became as stormy as the sky overhead.
Absolutely not,
he said. Jack stared back at him. It's the only way.
Says who? Says the gods, apparently.
But I guess you're too stubborn to bend even to your own gods' wills, Jack said, and couldn't stop the laugh that bubbled out of him at that thought. Judging by Hiccup's determined expression, he'd hit the nail on the head. I know what I'm doing now, Hiccup. After this, it'll all be over. Hiccup's lips parted. He took a step forward and put his hands on Jack's shoulders.
You don't get to sacrifice yourself,
he said in a voice that was suddenly sharp with emotion.
I don't care. There has to be another.
No, Jack quickly said. He hesitantly put his hand on Hiccup's. Nobody's going to die. We'll see. His voice broke slightly, panic spiking in his chest before he quickly forced it back down. He squeezed Hiccup's fingers before gently moving his hand away and then the other. We'll see each other again. You just have to believe in me. Hiccup slowly lowered his arms but held on to one of Jack's hands. Fear glimmered in his eyes.
Then why?
He started, voice weak.
Why does it feel like you're saying goodbye right now?
Jack could feel it too, and he was glad Hiccup was able to put it into words. It meant at least part of him understood. In a way, Jack was saying goodbye. At least, Jackson Overland was. You're one of the cleverest people I've ever known, Jack said, squeezing Hiccup's hand again. You just have to keep your eyes open. You get it, don't you? Hiccup's Adam's apple bobbed.
Do I?
He asked feebly. Jack didn't try to stop the smile growing on his face. Along his cheek, neck, and shoulder, the cold was quickly becoming unbearable. He looked down at their intertwined fingers. Both their hands were trembling, but still holding on. There's just one thing I have to do first, Jack said. Hiccup's brows twitched in confusion when Jack took another step closer to him. If he made another face when Jack kissed him, Jack didn't know. He closed his eyes. The kiss lasted only for a moment before Jack pulled back. He forced himself to open his eyes. Hiccup's lips were parted in shock. He looked more like Jack had slapped him than anything. Jack didn't know what to say either.
How?
Hiccup started, even weaker.
How long?
Jack felt as though he was about to pass out. A weird shaky laugh escaped him, and he had to avert his eyes. I think I've known for a while. Sort of, he said. Just didn't realize, He paused again, swallowing with difficulty. He glanced at Hiccup. I was afraid of putting the pieces together, that I would ruin everything we had. Hiccup's hand was still holding Jack's, but it looked like he wasn't even aware of it.
What we had?
I always knew our time was limited, Jack said. The thought of getting something only to lose it again terrified me, so I didn't think about the details. I just thought, wow, this Hiccup guy is really... He trailed off, staring at his feet. He still wasn't very good at the whole conversation business, especially not these conversations. I really love him. And that was it, really. It didn't matter how. I just did. I just do. He slowly looked up again, afraid that he really had ruined everything, but when he did, Hiccup had his eyes closed. There was a tiny smile on his face. Sorry for being so dense, Jack added, but I get it now. I hope you don't mind. Hiccup suddenly laughed.
Mind?
He repeated. Finally, he opened his eyes.
You really are dense.
Jack frowned. He opened his mouth to retaliate, but Hiccup kissed him before he could. He felt his hand on the side of his face, warm against the singeing cold of the Snow Queen's mark. Jack couldn't stop the laugh that babbled out of him. Somehow, out of everything that had happened the past month, this felt the most unreal. Hiccup pulled back, but kept his hand on Jack's cheek, pressing their foreheads together. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but just then a pulsation made the air around them tremble. They broke apart and turned to the valley. I have to go, Jack said, but grabbed Hiccup's hand again. Desperation made his mind spin. Remember what I said. You have to believe in me. Keep your eyes open. I know how to end this, just please wait for me here. Hiccup's eyes blazed. He looked like he wanted to argue, his hand tight around Jack's.
I trust you,
he said, and the way he said it almost made it sound like a threat.
Come back from this.
I will, Jack said. I promise I will. And he pulled out of Hiccup's grip. It was with obvious difficulty that Hiccup let him go. Jack just smiled before turning around and walking with confident steps down into the valley. The wind picked up as he approached the forest. Snow started falling from the sky, whipping against Jack's face and hands and feet. It swirled around him in an unnatural way. "That was sweet," the Snow Queen's voice sounded, drifting in between the trees along with the howling of the wind. "Long overdue, I take it. Are you sure you want to leave him there, unprotected?" "He's not unprotected," Jack replied and kept walking. Behind him, the hill leading up to Hiccup disappeared behind the canopy. "You could try to go after him. I wouldn't advise it, though." The wind whistled, shaking the trees as if they were laughing. "What a transformation," Snow cooed. "You weren't this foolhardy just a few hours ago. What changed?" "I'll show you," Jack said. "Do you want to see?" He came to a stop, feeling like he'd reached the point where the Snow Queen's power was the strongest. The forest was thick around him, blocking out the moonlight. Snow's mark was so cold it felt hot. With the last show of swirling snowflakes, the Snow Queen materialized a few meters away from Jack. Though she was a master at keeping her face impassive, there was a new light in her eyes now. Not just fear, panic. "You will not take this away from me," she said. "Winter is my kingdom." Jack took a step towards her. "It was never yours," he said. "It doesn't belong to anyone. I'm going to warn you one last time. We don't have to do this." The Snow Queen's eye flashed white. "Arrogant boy," she hissed. The ground erupted like a volcano. Jack felt himself getting flung into the air and his mind blanketed. All he saw was white and all he felt was cold. Cold everywhere, all around him, inside him, rocketing through his veins like electricity. The wind howled like a beast. Or was it Jack that was howling? It felt as if he took a breath for the first time in months. The world was mapped out around him, calling to him from every direction. The wind enveloped him, and he was weightless. The world came back into view just as he landed softly in the snow. Around them, the trees bent under the pressure, creating a huge, perfectly round clearing. Jack looked at his staff. Frost climbed along the bark. He looked up. The Snow Queen stood there, staring. She shook her head. "How?" she whispered. She looked so afraid, Jack almost felt sorry for her. Almost. He took a step forward and bowed, not once breaking eye contact. "Your Majesty," he said, "my name is Jack Frost. I'm a good liar, but I'm afraid to you I was always telling the truth." The fear in the Snow Queen's face rapidly turned to stony fury. Jack thought she would say something. After their lengthy conversation earlier, one would have thought their relationship had moved past the awkward silence. But no. She threw her hand out, and a wave of ice and snow shot towards Jack. Winter spirit or not, Jack doubted getting a face full of that would be comfortable. He jumped out of the way, and with a yelp felt the wind pick him up. He swirled into the air, much like the first time he'd gotten acquainted with the wind, and somersaulted a few times before remembering how to keep his balance. A delighted laugh erupted from his chest. He'd forgotten how exhilarating it was to be Jack Frost. The forest stretched out around him. The mountains weren't as imposing as they had been just moments ago. If Hiccup still stood at the hilltop, Jack couldn't see him. The snowfall was too thick. The Snow Queen materialized in the air, blending almost seamlessly into the blizzard like some kind of terrible specter. Her cloak and the wispy fabric of her dress defied the strong wind, billowing softly as if in slow motion. She made to lunge at Jack, and as she did, she dispersed into snowflakes and rematerialized into an eagle. Jack shot out of the way, and she disappeared into the storm. He whirled around, but she was completely gone. Jack closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm, but it was the Snow Queen's will against his own. She had created the storm, and so fighting it would only make it worse. He opened his eyes again, just as a flash of white shot towards him and hit him in the chest. The collision sent him rocketing towards the ground. He registered hitting several branches on the way down. He landed on his back with a wheeze and a curse. He didn't get a break. Something shimmered in the air above him, and he quickly rolled to the side before he could get impaled by a giant icicle. He jumped to his feet and shot back into the sky. "Snow!" he yelled. "I don't want to fight you." "Liar," came the Snow Queen's voice just behind him. Jack whirled around, but it felt as if a blanket of pure wind was being wrapped around him, restraining him. He fought against it, but before he managed to break free, the Snow Queen grabbed him and hurled them both towards the ground. So much for being an untouchable Ice Queen. Evidently, she wasn't afraid to take things to a physical level. Again, Jack hit the ground and the world spun. He broke free of the wind straitjacket and managed to swing his staff before another knife-sharp icicle could hit him. The icicle split in two and barely missed. He looked around for the Snow Queen, but only spotted her the moment she materialized out of thin air and pinned him to the ground. Her frightened, slightly fearful expression almost made her look like a child. Jack could see the girl who had been buried under the snow in there, but her words didn't match her appearance.
"You've bested me once," she said, "but that doesn't help you. I can kill you now. It's the only way." Her hands clamped around Jack's wrists, sending bolts of pain down his arms to his chest. He let out a strangled cry. A triumphant little smile began to grow on Snow's face. As Jack's mind began to cloud over, he realized there was no way to make her understand. At least not while she was this powerful. He needed to fight back. A part of him was still scared, the part of him that hadn't quite caught up with the fact that he was Jack Frost again. But he was starting to remember. He'd shot pitch out of the sky, he'd created blizzards, he'd frozen an ocean even when his powers were at his weakest. He could put a spirit with a superiority complex in her place. His mind expanded to the clouds, and the sky flashed. A cry tore through him, and it was as if the air itself turned to ice. The Snow Queen cried out, the force of Jack's magic catapulting her into a tree trunk. When she hit the ground, she was quick to push herself up, but her arms shook with the strain. Her eyes were back to the normal blue. She looked astonished, but her attention was torn away from Jack when a rumble sounded from the mountain above them. She made a quiet, whimpering noise. "You think you're clever, don't you?"
she asked, venom in her voice. Jack didn't understand what she was talking about before he followed her gaze. A wave of white was thundering down the mountainside straight towards them. "Oh no," Jack said. "I didn't mean—" The Snow Queen turned into a mini blizzard and rushed towards him. In the next second, it felt as if he'd been hit by a giant baseball bat, launching him back up into the sky. Jack called on the wind, and he shot out of the Snow Queen's course. He closed his eyes and extended his senses as if he were inhabiting the countless snowflakes drifting with the wind. He could feel Snow's presence shooting through those snowflakes, invisible. With a furious cry, he swung his staff, finally letting go of the last of his restraints. Ice and electricity exploded like fireworks around him. The Snow Queen appeared in the air, holding her arms in front of her face. Jack's magic collided against some protective field, but it was clear she was struggling. Beneath them, the avalanche thundered into the valley like a tidal wave, dragging with it boulders and trees, threatening to bury the forest completely. Above them, the clouds swirled faster than ever, flickering with lightning. Electricity made the air vibrate. Jack flung his staff, sending a spark of bright blue at Snow. She flurried away and caught Jack off guard by appearing right in front of him, wrestling him. He realized a moment too late what she was doing. She tugged the satchel off his belt. "No!" Jack yelled, grabbing Snow's wrist. The contact felt like two opposing magnets meeting, flinging them away from each other, but Snow still held the satchel. For a horrifying moment, Jack wondered what would happen if he let her keep it. Obviously, she sensed he needed it. If he happened to lose the crystals, they wouldn't have any other choice but to stay. It was sickening how tempting it was. But the thought of Jamie never seeing his mother, sister, and grandma again was even worse. The corners of Jack's vision darkened with anger. He raised his staff and felt the sheer power of the blizzard get sucked into it before it all shot towards the Snow Queen in the form of a thunderstorm. Maybe it was a bit of an overreaction, but it worked. When the whiteout cleared, Jack couldn't see the Snow Queen nor the satchel. He decided he'd be able to locate the latter later, but he could still feel Snow's aura somewhere on the ground. He flew towards it and found her leaned against a tree, clutching her stomach as if she were bleeding out. Jack landed a few meters away from her, and she looked up. As she did, her legs went out beneath her, and she slid against the tree trunk. Jack lowered his staff. "Your reign is over, Snow," he told her. "Stop fighting." Snow's face had never been as open as it was now. It showed every bit of her shock, anger, fear, and bitter amusement. "You're unstable," she told him. "There's a weakness inside of you." "Okay," Jack said. "Still beat you, though." Snow made a soft noise that might have been a laugh or something along those lines. "But you feel it, don't you? You must." She tilted her head to the side, looking at him as if she could see right into his mind. "You could be even more powerful than this." "If this is your villainous love makes you weak speech, you can spare it," Jack told her. Snow turned her gaze to the sky as if she were caught by a sudden daydream.
Love, she repeated flatly. There's that too, I suppose. Are you going to kill me, Jack Frost?
His face must have told her the answer. Her lips quirked upwards.
I thought so. I'll do what I have to do, Jack said, but there are other ways. I don't need to kill you. Then there's a chance I'll break free of whatever prison you put me in, Snow said. Do you want me to kill you? Jack asked, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. You said it yourself. We aren't the same. You see, winter is something deadly and merciless. I choose to see the life in it.
What little there was of humor in Snow's face disappeared.
How noble, she said. Let's see how long you last.
Jack frowned. What? Pain flared down the side of his body, making him spasm and fall to his knees. Then, as soon as it had begun, it stopped. He looked up just in time to see the Snow Queen beginning to disperse into snowflakes.
You should have finished me off, Jack, she cooed.
No! Jack yelled, but it was too late. She was already gone. Jack touched the side of his face. He couldn't feel the Snow Queen's mark. For some reason he just assumed it would disappear once he became Jack Frost, but it seemed that wasn't true. Or maybe the Snow Queen had just used the last remains of her power over him to make her escape. Either way, the pain was gone now, hopefully for good. And as the pain subsided, so did the storm. Jack became acutely aware of the sudden calm. The wind was still. It had stopped snowing. In the sky, the clouds were already beginning to part, letting down beams of moonlight. Then a horrible sound cut through the silence.
Jack!
Hiccup's voice echoed through the valley. His voice was ragged with panic.
Jack! Jack, please!
Jack kicked off the ground and flew over to what was left of the forest. Hiccup was sprinting down the hill, stumbling and falling, but never slowing down. He kept crying Jack's name, begging for any kind of response. It took a moment before Jack remembered that there had just been an avalanche. Hiccup had to think he was dead.
Hiccup!
Jack yelled. Hiccup didn't seem to hear him. He ran into the forest, sometimes digging through the snow in random places, as if he would have been able to find Jack's buried body that way.
No, no, no,
Jack heard him whimper.
No, please, no.
Jack landed nearby. There was a hollowness expanding in his chest. Hiccup, he tried again. Hiccup did not hear him. As he continued crying out Jack's name, never once laying his eyes on him, everything began to feel very, very far away. Hiccup's voice turned muffled, as if Jack really were buried under hundreds of pounds of snow. Jack found himself following Hiccup on foot until Hiccup eventually collapsed and buried his face in his hands. Jack almost couldn't bear it. He walked around Hiccup, kneeling in front of him as Hiccup let out a gut-wrenching sob. He'd never seen him cry before.
Hiccup,
Jack tried again.
Please look up. You...
His voice failed him when Hiccup didn't respond. All Hiccup did was give a furious howl, thrashing at the snow. He bent over again and raked his fingers through his hair, tugging at it while rocking back and forth. It started to snow. The feeling of the flakes against his hands must have roused Hiccup from his grief, because he looked up, something between hope and alarm in his bright, bloodshot eyes. He looked around, his body quaking with tiny gasps. And then his eyes fixed on Jack. At least, that's what Jack thought, for just a moment. But then Hiccup shakily got to his feet and stumbled forward, passing through Jack like a ghost. The last bit of hope that this could just be some cruel joke went up in smoke. Jack brought his hands to his chest, staring blankly at the spot Hiccup had just been sitting. "I thought you understood," Jack wanted to say, but what was the point? The snowfall got thicker, but Jack couldn't get it to stop. In that moment, there wasn't a single part of him that wanted to even try. The universe narrowed down to just this disappointment, this grief, this gruesome, familiar loneliness. The sound of a body falling into the snow was what finally pushed Jack to move. He turned around, and his heart tried exiting through his throat. "Hiccup," he hissed. "Idiot!" Because what Hiccup had put his eyes on was apparently Jack's satchel, and for some reason he had thought it a good idea to take the quest for crystal pieces into his own hands. On top of that, he had also ignored his own advice about sitting down before touching the crystal, and was now lying sprawled in the snow with one hand buried in the satchel. Jack didn't even know the crystal was energized, but he guessed that it was his own magic that had done it this time. He groaned, hurrying over to Hiccup. At least, now that he was unconscious, Jack could touch him. It didn't make him feel much better, but he moved him to a more comfortable position under a tree. He took the satchel and for a few seconds just sat there, holding Hiccup's limp hand in his own. He had to go after him, of course, into the vision, and after that... Jack held back a pathetic whimper. This wasn't the time. He had to act quickly before Hiccup got lost in the vision. He sat down at the other side of the tree, took a deep breath, and put his hand into the satchel. It only took him a second to recognize the time and place. He'd been in the forest before, both in life and in a vision. He'd appeared in almost the same spot as when he saw Emily with her son, Jack. He wasn't sure exactly how he figured it out so quickly. Maybe it was something about the temperature, cold but not biting. Or maybe it was the light. It was close to sundown. "Jack!" He'd almost forgotten that Jamie wasn't with him this time. And it wasn't Emily's voice saying his name, though Jack knew she would soon. It was Hiccup. Jack turned around and saw him stumbling through the woods towards the frozen pond. "Hiccup, don't!" he started before remembering it was futile. He hurried after him, kicking off the ground and floating up to the side. Though he thought he knew where and when he was, the sight of the pond still made his stomach threaten to turn itself inside out. His body froze when he saw Emily and himself, Emily standing in the middle of a spiderweb of cracks in the ice, and Jackson Overland standing barefoot a couple of meters away from her, speaking in a soft, reassuring tone. From the moment Jack realized the crystals showed them scenes from their past, he'd been scared this would happen. At the same time, he couldn't say he was surprised. It seemed inevitable. The crystals brought them back to significant moments in their lives. What was more significant than his own death? "Jack!" Hiccup tried again. He started staggering down towards the pond. "Hold on, you—" "Jack!" Emily said. Of course, neither she nor Jackson showed any sign that they'd hurt Hiccup. "I'm scared." Hiccup stopped. He blinked, then waved his hand, trying to catch Jackson's attention. He stood in a position where, if he really had been there was no way Jackson wouldn't have spotted him. But Jackson continued to look at his sister, taking a tentative step towards her. Cracks started appearing beneath him as well. I know, he said, hiding his fear behind a smile. "But you're gonna be all right. You're not gonna fall in." Jack, present Jack, stood by Hiccup's side. He wanted to look away and cover his ears, but he couldn't. He watched the scene unfold. Beside him, Hiccup looked down at his hands as if checking that he was still there. He looked up when Jackson announced they would have some fun instead. "Emily," Hiccup murmured, his brows furrowed. "Jack, you said... This doesn't make any sense." Jack vaguely remembered telling Hiccup that Emily had passed before Jamie was born, which would be 11 years ago. That would put Jackson at 6 years old. He definitely didn't look 6 years old here. Emily's voice trembled with fear. Jack knew the conversation by heart, even after all this time, even after not knowing it for 3 centuries. And yet, hearing it and seeing it from this helpless position was almost worse. There was nothing he could do but watch and let it happen. "You have to believe in me," Jackson said. Jack sat down, bringing his knees to his chest. Hiccup remained standing, his posture stiff with shock and confusion. "You want to play a game?" Jackson asked. "We're going to play hopscotch, like we play every day. It's as easy as—" He took a step towards the wooden staff lying inconspicuously on the ice a couple of meters away from him. Jack wondered what would have happened if Emily hadn't found it in the forest earlier and decided to bring it with her. 1. Jackson concealed his wince behind an over-the-top show of losing his balance. Emily laughed. Despite it all, Jack felt himself smile. 2, Jackson said, then nimbly leapt towards the staff. 3. He picked the staff up and carefully pointed it at Emily. "All right, now it's your turn." Emily inched forward. 1, Jackson murmured. That's it. 2. The ice cracked dangerously beneath Emily. Hiccup took a step forward, but seemed to realize that even if he'd actually been present, there was no way he'd be able to help. He brought his hands to his chest, wringing them and shaking his head in disbelief. 3! In the next moment, Jackson and Emily had swapped places. Emily slid across the ice and looked up, unharmed. Jackson sat up, and seeing this, his face broke into a relieved smile. Jack wanted to yell at him not to stand up, but he remembered where his thoughts had been. Emily was safe. The fact that he was the one in danger now hadn't even crossed his mind. Jackson began to stand. "No!" Hiccup yelled when it happened. He stumbled down to the pond, but stopped at the edge, pressing his hands over his mouth. Jack tried not to imagine how horrible it had to be for him, seeing Jack die twice in a day without any way to stop it. "Jack!" Emily shrieked. And then she screamed, and Jack found himself standing up. This part was unfamiliar to him. "No, no!" It was unbearable. First Hiccup, and now Emily, screaming his name, begging him to miraculously come back. Emily had always thought him invincible, but he wasn't going to resurface. Not in a while, anyway. As Emily wailed, her voice echoing through the calm winter air, Jack's knees gave way beneath him. He crumpled against the tree, whispering apologies. He didn't want to see this. He already knew he'd left her behind. He already knew how much she would be hurting after this. It was too much, and yet he couldn't close his eyes. Eventually, Emily managed to push herself away from the gap in the ice. She pulled off her ice skates and ran back towards the house. Jack didn't even realize what he was doing before he had pushed off the ground. The next moments passed in a haze. Emily burst through the front door of their house and ran into her mother's arms. She wasn't able to form any words, but Jack's mom understood anyway. Her face went pale, and when realization and despair made it to her eyes, Jack still couldn't make himself look away. He watched how she told Emily to stay in the house, cradling her face desperately before running out the door as if there was still a chance of saving her son. Emily sank to the floor, letting out a guttural sob. Jack had long forgotten why he was there. It was hard remembering that Emily couldn't see or hear him. It was hard accepting it. He couldn't just stand there while she cried. He had to tell her, somehow, that he was okay, and that she would be okay. "Emily," he said, kneeling in front of her. His voice came out as a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry, He touched the floorboards, and tiny specks of frost appeared around his hand. But that was impossible, wasn't it? He'd never been able to interact with anything in these visions before. He looked up at the ceiling. He closed his eyes. A moment later, a small snowflake touched his nose. Emily gave a quiet gasp, and he opened his eyes. The snowfall wasn't much, not like it had been in Jamie's bedroom, but it was still there, and still just as impossible. Emily's mouth hung open, briefly distracted from her grief. She let out an incredulous whimper. "I'm here, Emily," Jack said. He reached out to her. "I'm right here." His hand brushed over Emily's, and her eyes snapped down to it. Her brows twitched as she looked around the room, hazel eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. Or maybe it was more like belief. "What?" she whispered. "How?" Jack was smiling now. He thought he might be crying too. "It's not all bad," he told her. "Everything turns out well in the end. Believe me." Emily's breath hitched. "Jack?" She didn't look at him, and she didn't act like she'd heard him either, but there was something in her voice. She sounded so certain. "Yes," Jack said, leaning closer to her. "I'm here." Emily's eyes widened. The ghost of a smile played just at the corners of her lips. "You," she breathed. A couple of tears trickled down her cheeks. "It's you, isn't it?" "Yes," Jack said again, raising his voice in his excitement. Emily held up a hand. Her fingers were shaking. Jack was almost afraid as he raised his own hand and ever so carefully brushed his fingers against hers. He still passed through her, but Emily gasped. She made a noise somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Jack laughed too. "There you go," he cheered. "I'm not gone, you see? I'll always be there. Remember that." Emily's face contorted, new tears spilling over. "I love you," she sobbed. "Jack." She didn't get any further. At least Jack didn't hear anything more, but even as the vision dissolved, Jack thought he understood something now that he hadn't before. Why he'd been so powerful, even when no one believed in him. It was Emily. Always Emily and her spirit shining through everyone that came after her. Hiccup didn't know how long he sat there. The ice was solid where he'd sunk to his knees, but he could clearly see the hole not that far away from him. Emily had left, and her cries still echoed in Hiccup's head. Humans weren't made to hear such grief, he thought, especially not from a child. At some point after, a woman had showed up. Hiccup turned his eyes away as she also crumpled by the edge of the pond. Jack's mother. It wasn't a far-fetched guess. Both her children had taken after her. Eventually, the woman left as well. There was nothing she could do. At that point, the sun had begun to set, casting a pinkish glow over the frozen pond. Hiccup could no longer remember how he'd gotten here. It was like walking into a room and then realizing he had no idea what he'd intended to do in there, except he was having trouble recalling even who he was. He had a weird feeling he was intruding, but he didn't know how. The only thing he knew with absolute clarity was that he just watched his friend die. The light of the sunset caught something glimmering near the edge of the pond. Hiccup thought it was only a shard of ice at first, but when he looked closer at it, he realized it was blue and almost glowing. Something stirred in the back of Hiccup's mind. He got to his feet.
The crystal, he thought. You have to collect them. Jack and Jamie need them to get home.
Jack and Jamie. Hiccup's heart sped up. His mind felt as if it was being unraveled and pieced together at the same time. Everything Jack had told him, had it all been lies? He refused to believe that. Even when things didn't add up, Jack had always seemed sincere. Hiccup walked around the frozen pond until he reached the crystal. He stared at it, his thoughts becoming clearer by the second. Simultaneously, he was becoming more confused. He looked one last time at the hole in the ice.
Who are you? He murmured. Jack.
He reached down and picked up the crystal, and the world went abruptly dark. In the next moment, he sat up with a gasp. He shuddered, looking around. He was back in the valley. What had just happened? That vision. Jack had told him they were moments from his and Jamie's lives, but that was impossible. It had to be impossible. He became aware that his fist was closed around something. He already knew what it was, but he was still reluctant to look. The crystal he'd found in the vision shimmered faintly in the moonlight, solid and real. He stared at it. His thoughts were racing so fast it was nearly painful. It felt as if several moments from these past months were playing in his head at the same time. He remembered those first days, how strange Jack had seemed to him, how unaccustomed he'd been to other people. He remembered how reluctant Jack had been to open up, the distance he'd put between himself and everyone else. He remembered Jack's yearning for the sky, despite having never even seen a dragon before. He remembered how fearless he'd been during their first flight together, as if he'd been born to fly, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. He remembered Jack defending magic and spirit so fiercely, the anger in his eyes when Hiccup said they were less than alive. But it hadn't just been anger. He had looked hurt, too. He had looked scared. He remembered flying with Toothless the day after Jack and Jamie's mysterious arrival. He remembered wondering how they'd survived the blizzard. The word demigod had popped into his head. Even then, he'd known there was something weird going on. He remembered the moment Jack had told him the Snow Queen thought he had something that belonged to her. He remembered how confused he, Hiccup, was over the fact that the infamous Snow Queen could feel threatened by someone as harmless as Jack. He remembered the Snow Queen whispering to him as if she were telling him a secret. He is not what you think he is. Remember that. He remembered the snowball fight. He remembered dreaming about a frozen sea and bright blue eyes. He remembered the Snow Queen and Jack's conversation and the accusation in Jack's voice. It took everything from me too, but it didn't turn me into what you've become. He remembered his and Jack's conversation as they worked their way through Eden's special mead. How Jack had seemed so distant and skittish, almost like he'd been in the very beginning. He told Hiccup he thought he was going to face his Red Death all over again. Jack was scared of water, but somehow Hiccup could tell that wasn't what he meant. Jack feared isolation. Wherever he was going, he thought he might end up alone again. He remembered the past hours, how there was no way Jack could have survived being dropped in a pool of freezing water and then fly for hours through the cold night. And yet he had. He remembered, so long ago now, sitting around a table in the great hall. He remembered admiring how good Jack was with kids, and how Hiccup never would have had dinner with Brad and the others if it weren't for him and Jamie. He remembered being amused by Jamie's belief in the Snow Queen, and then another name. You're cool Frosty. He remembered the drunken Jack mumbling something about a nickname he'd used to have. Not sure if I'm him anymore. I'm not sure if I ever will be. Hiccup closed his hand around the crystal. All this time he'd gone wondering what Jack's deal was, and he'd had the answer all along. That vision, whatever it was merely the last straw. He couldn't explain it away anymore. He didn't want to explain it away. You're called Frosty, he mouthed. Jack Frost. Just then, there was a noise behind him. It was so faint, Hiccup couldn't tell what it was at first. Then it came again, and he realized it was the sound of someone sniffling. Slowly, he turned around. Jack was sitting a couple of meters away from him, staring vacantly at the ground. At least he thought it was Jack. His hair was unquestionably different. At least white looked good on him. His clothes were the same. No shoes, of course, except there was frost on his shoulders and sleeves. And he was holding his staff, as he always did. Hiccup thought his inner voice acted a lot calmer than he felt right now. It took him several tries before he managed to find his actual voice.
Jack?
Jack started, his eyes snapping to Hiccup. They were blue. For some reason, this wasn't as surprising as it maybe should have been. After all, Hiccup felt as if he'd seen them blue before. He stared at Hiccup as if he were the one who just survived an avalanche and come out of it looking like that. Jack's lower lip trembled.
Can you see?
He didn't get any further. Hiccup scrambled forwards and tackled him in a hug. Jack made a choked noise, but Hiccup didn't pay it any mind. In the midst of his relief, he didn't even have it in him to consider the weirdness of the situation. What Jack was, it didn't matter, did it? As long as he was alive.
How?
Jack started, his voice thick with emotion.
You couldn't see me. How did you?
Hiccup pulled back. Jack's eyes were bloodshot, and Hiccup didn't doubt his own were as well. When Jack's breath hitched, the surprise in his face the same as the first time they'd spoken together, Hiccup couldn't help but grin. Everything was just falling into place so suddenly. He put a hand carefully on Jack's cheek, reveling in the way Jack's eyes widened in response to the touch. It really was him.
I think I've known for a while,
he said, echoing Jack's words from earlier.
But I think I was afraid of putting the pieces together, too.
He trailed off, his eyes going up to Jack's white hair and back to his blue eyes. Jack, whose face had been bright with incredulous joy a second earlier, pressed his lips together. His whole body seemed to shrink. He opened his mouth, but didn't immediately speak.
Is it weird?
He asked, with a vulnerability Hiccup hadn't seen in him since their midnight outing. Hiccup reluctantly let his hand fall. He couldn't say that it wasn't. He thought for a moment about Jack's hazel eyes, wondering if he would miss them. Maybe a part of him would. But another part of him, the part that had silently been preparing for this moment without telling the other parts, had a hard time caring about it.
Why didn't you tell me?
Hiccup asked. Jack glanced up at him. I wanted to, he said.
I tried telling you several times, but
his voice wavered.
I was too scared.
And he was still scared. The realization felt like a heap of iron in Hiccup's chest. Hesitantly, he reached out and took Jack's hand.
I've said some terrible things, haven't I?
Jack squeezed his hand.
You didn't mean to. I'm not scared,
Hiccup said. Jack searched his expression, so he just smiled and shook his head.
I could never be scared of you. You're not exactly intimidating.
Jack laughed, and it was just more proof that this really was exactly the same boy that had kissed Hiccup on the top of that hill.
Wow, thank you,
he said. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but instead just smiled, shaking his head. His eyes were tear-rimmed. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered. Hiccup laughed hoarsely.
Says you,
he said.
I'm so sorry.
Hiccup kissed him. It took a moment before Jack tentatively returned the kiss. Obviously, this was new to him. Hiccup never thought he'd meet someone less experienced at kissing than himself, but here they were. He smiled, and the movement made Jack laugh. They pulled apart, and Hiccup brushed a tear off Jack's cheek. Jack's smile wavered.
You saw that, he said quietly. The vision. Oh,
Hiccup breathed. He brushed his thumb over the back of Jack's hand.
Yes, I guess that explains why you talked so calmly about death and stuff.
He grimaced at his eloquent choice of words.
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand what I was seeing. I'm not even sure if I understand it now.
I told you, Jack said with a feeble shrug. The visions are true. Hiccup looked at him.
So, then...
I can tell you everything, Jack said. His voice was getting steadier, but there was still a fearful lilt to his voice. I mean, you already know the worst part. Winter spirit and all.
I thought you'd say that the fact you died is the worst part,
Hiccup said.
So you're some kind of magical spirit. At least now I have an answer for why you hate shoes so much, I think. Actually, I still don't understand that part.
Jack's head fell back with a laugh. Why is that the part you're hung up on?
First impressions last, I guess,
Hiccup said. He was beginning to laugh as well. Jack's joy had always been infectious.
Are you going to tell me why you threw my old boots into a fire? Oh, gods.
He stared at Jack. Jack looked a bit alarmed.
What? Jack,
Hiccup said, sitting back and giving him an inquisitive look.
Answer me honestly on this one. Did it take an encounter with an actual, real-life goddess of love to make you figure out your own feelings?
The look Jack sent him said yes.
How did you...
Hiccup laughed incredulously.
Falcon feathers,
he said.
It's said that the goddess... Freya...
It was a bit hard saying the name. That would mean admitting that it had actually happened and that Jack's head really was made of air.
Wears a cloak made of falcon feathers.
Jack looked embarrassed. Enough about that, he decided. So I met a goddess. Big deal. Whatever, right? We've met... Oh no. It was Hiccup's turn to be alarmed. Jack suddenly got to his feet. The Snow Queen, he said. She's not gone. Hiccup got to his feet as well.
What was all this about then?
He asked, gesturing at the remnants of the forest around them. Thinking back at the storm now, he got chills. He'd thought it was the beginning of devastating winter. Turns out, the snow must have been a result of Jack's and the Snow Queen's powers clashing. To imagine Jack could withstand that, or even create that, maybe he could be a little intimidating. Not that it mattered. Hiccup's best friend was a night fury. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't intimidated by Toothless too sometimes. Not to mention Astrid. I had her, Jack said, turning his gaze to the forest. I could have beaten her, but I kept thinking there was a way to change her mind. I don't want to kill anyone. He looked back at Hiccup, his eyes full of fear. I think she's heading towards Berk. That was her last promise. Hiccup swallowed.
What do we do? He asked. Don't suppose Freya wants to give us a ride in her cat chariot?
Cat chariot? Never mind. Jack shook his head. We have to get there before she does. I know I'm strong enough to beat her.
Jack,
Hiccup said, tilting his head to meet his eyes.
We don't have a dragon.
Jack blinked. Oh, that's what you meant, he said. Then he smiled, a mischievous, secretive smile. Hiccup, he started, remember when you first offered to be my friend, how I jumped off that cliff?
Maybe you don't phrase it like that,
Hiccup suggested. Well, I already told you it wasn't what you thought I was doing, Jack said. Now, with this new information, want to take a wild guess on what I was actually attempting? Hiccup had a vague suspicion. He wasn't keen on voicing it, though.
I'm good,
he admitted.
Just tell me.
Jack grinned. Jamie was surprised by how warm he was during the entire flight to Berk. He guessed it had to do with the magic feather cloak. He never wanted to take it off. They'd landed right outside the Thorsten hut, and Jamie banged on the door.
Ruff! Tough!
He yelled, uncaring if he woke the entire village.
I need your help! Jack Frost needs your help! I'm serious!
The door swung open, revealing a very disgruntled Roughnut.
The lady needs her beauty sleep, kid, she growled. You better have a good reason to interrupt mine.
Behind her, Toughnut stood, but his eyes were closed, like he was sleepwalking. He muttered something incomprehensible. Jamie stepped into the hut and patted his cheek repeatedly until he snorted and blinked his eyes open.
What? He greeted.
The Snow Queen is coming, Jamie said. Jack is getting his powers back. He's our only chance, or the Snow Queen is going to bring the worst devastating winter you have ever seen. But he needs to get stronger. We need to get people to believe in him.
Roughnut looked thoroughly unimpressed.
I hate to break it to you, but people don't believe in anything this early in the morning, she said. Try again later, kiddo.
She'll be here tomorrow,
Jamie protested, pushing the door back open when Roughnut tried to close it.
You have to tell them to get ready. Tell them there's an attack coming. Jack sent me here to warn you.
Sent you? Toughnut mumbled in a yawn. We saw you just a few hours ago.
Jamie glared at him.
Yes, and then Jack got kidnapped and we went after him and I only just came back, he said. I've been flying for hours. Toothless is exhausted. Jack and Hiccup are still on Glacier Island as far as I know, and Jack is my great-great-something uncle.
The last part came unexpected to all three of them.
Jamie raised his chin. "Do you want to die?" he asked curtly. Roughnut and Toughnut exchanged looks. "I'm gonna go with no," Toughnut replied slowly.
"Then trust me on this," Jamie said. "If we get Berk to believe in Jack Frost, he can blast the Snow Queen to the moon and beyond. But we have to act now."
Toughnut's eyes suddenly blazed. "He still owes me an electric shock," he said. "Come on, sister, we have a job to do." He marched out of the house, leaving Roughnut in the doorway with a sour expression. She groaned. "Fine," she said, "but if the Snow Queen asks me about the bags under my eyes, I'm blaming you."
Jamie grinned. "I'll go get my friends," he said.
"And I thought riding a dragon was scary,"
Hiccup shrieked.
"Oh God, this isn't safe, Jack. Oh,
Language, Jack scolded, squeezing Hiccup's hand. His touch was cold, but Hiccup was gradually getting used to it.
"This is perfectly safe. Just imagine you have your flight suit."
"My flight suit isn't safe either."
The wind rippled through Hiccup's hair. The only thing between him and the ocean rushing past below them was, well, nothing. Jack laughed.
"You're supposed to be a master of the skies, Hiccup," he said. "Enjoy it."
Just then, a gust of wind took a hold of them, propelling them upwards. Hiccup wasn't proud of the way he shrieked. Scratch everything else that had happened ever since Jack came to Berk. This was wholeheartedly the weirdest thing he had ever taken part in. It was one thing believing that Jack could fly on his own, but a completely other thing actually experiencing it. Hiccup clutched Jack's hand like his life depended on it, which, of course, it did.
"Sorry," Jack said. "I'm not that familiar with the wind here, and I'm probably a bit tired after that fight."
"There's different winds in different places?"
Hiccup asked, daring to glance up from the ocean to Jack flying serenely beside him. God, this was weird. He felt like he was dreaming.
"How do you know if it's friendly?"
"You don't,"
Jack said reassuringly.
"Some wind sprites are friendly, some are more violent, just like the wind always is."
Hiccup tried imagining this, but decided he'd just accept it. He glanced behind himself, but Glacier Island was already long gone. Around them was only ocean.
So,
he started, attempting to sound conversational.
"How long have you been doing this exactly?"
Jack kept his gaze ahead, but Hiccup could see how nervous he looked at that question.
"Promise you won't freak out?"
he asked in such a small voice it was hard hearing him through the wind.
"I'm very freaked out right now, but it has nothing to do with you,"
Hiccup said. Jack sent him a lopsided smile.
"I told you. Just hold on to me and you're fine," he said.
I know, just getting used to it."
Jack looked over at him for a few more seconds. The shadows under his eyes already looked darker than usual, but they seemed to become even heavier. He looked ahead again.
"I went under the ice when I was 17, he said. "Then I spent 300 years as a spirit. Then, for all I know, I might be physically 18 now, which is bizarre to me. I haven't had a growth spurt since—"
He glanced at Hiccup and got quiet. Hiccup blinked.
"That's a long time,"
he told him.
"Yep,"
Jack agreed. His smile was sheepish.
"I'd love to say it didn't feel that long, but—"
"Is that what you've been talking about when you say work?"
Hiccup asked.
"What were you doing all that time?"
"Same as the Snow Queen, sort of,"
Jack admitted. It felt as if he was challenging Hiccup's ability to not freak out. Hiccup resolutely kept his head cool.
"Except the Snow Queen sort of just boosts winter when it's already in season. She doesn't control it in the way I do. She brings devastating winter, and I bring, well, winter, and all the joy that comes with it."
He sent Hiccup half a smile before looking ahead again.
"There are other winter sprites, of course, but I'm sort of the boss."
Hiccup snorted.
"The boss?"
"Yeah, and you're going to be chief one day," Jack said, an amused glint in his eyes. "We're a good match, don't you think?"
Hiccup hated how warm his cheeks felt.
"I guess so,"
he murmured. A few seconds of silence followed. Hiccup studied Jack as the other stared ahead. He seemed weary. Either the fight against the Snow Queen had left him exhausted, or the emotional toll was really doing a number on him.
"I'm not freaking out,"
Hiccup told him. Jack huffed.
"I would, if I were you."
"After all we've been through? I doubt it."
Hiccup squeezed his hand.
"Tell me more, like how you got here in the first place. You said it was your—"
He didn't get any further when another strong wind sent them rocketing downwards. So suddenly Hiccup's stomach turned into a knot, and he held back what would otherwise have been a terrible scream. Jack tugged him closer and wrapped around him like a koala, and for a few seconds they just barreled through the air, so quickly Hiccup lost all sense of how close they were to the water. Then, just as suddenly, they were floating calmly again. Hiccup dared open his eyes, finding Jack's face very close to his own. "I'm a bit rusty in the flying department, I think," Jack admitted with a sheepish chuckle, "but everything is under control." Hiccup became aware that his back was to the ocean, and Jack was more or less lying on his stomach, holding him up with both his arms and legs. Thankfully, he was used to Toothless's hissy fits, so a few uncontrollable barrel rolls were no longer enough to make his last meal come back up.
"Oh, good," he said weakly. "How long will this take exactly?"
"Not sure," Jack said, leisurely turning around in the air so that Hiccup was on top of him instead. "If I were alone, it could have taken minutes, but I won't take my chances with a passenger. Thought we might take it a bit slow for your sake."
"For my sake?" Hiccup blurted. "Are you aware of how fast Toothless is? He's the fastest dragon there is."
Jack raised his brows. "Why, if you want to go fast, you could have said so," he cooed, smirking. He suddenly turned them around again, and for a moment Hiccup felt like he was falling, but then Jack gripped his hand, and they were back in their previous position, side by side. "You sure you're ready for that, though?" Hiccup clicked his tongue.
"Of course I am," he lied. "It'll be fun."
Jack grinned. He came in a bit closer and, for some reason, tapped the tip of Hiccup's nose. "As you wish," he said. He turned his face to the sky and yelled, "Wind! Take us home!" Hiccup wasn't sure how the wind understood what Jack meant by home, but when it immediately started picking up, he could only hope that it did. And the next moment, the wind rushed up from underneath them. It felt like falling upwards. Hiccup expected to be terrified. Instead, once they burst through the cloud layer, he let out an exhilarated laugh.
"This is amazing!"
he felt himself exclaim, but he could barely hear himself. Jack laughed too. His hair and cloak fluttered wildly, the clouds below them flashing by in a blur of silver. He closed his eyes and stretched his arms out, holding his staff high, his chest expanding as he inhaled. "I know," he replied. Then he grinned wickedly and tugged Hiccup closer. Hiccup yelped, but Jack only snickered. "Hold on to me. This might get rocky." They shot onwards, and Hiccup wrapped his arms around Jack's shoulders. Through the raging mix of terror and joy, a hysterical voice in the back of Hiccup's mind wondered if this could count as a first date. The idea made him feel ridiculously giddy. He'd have to ask Jack about that later. The wind tossed them hither and thither, up and down and sometimes even in loops, but they kept steadily heading in the same direction. Hiccup couldn't tell if it was Jack or the wind steering them, or possibly a shared effort. All he did know was, with each passing second, his fear diminished more and more, leaving only exhilaration and wonder. He'd dreamed about this before. Of course he had. Everyone dreams about flying, especially when you have a dragon who allows you to partially live out that dream. But this feeling was different from both flying a dragon and flying in a dream, a difference which Hiccup was quickly deciding wasn't bad at all. But that was before Jack's hold on his hand suddenly loosened. Hiccup snapped his eyes to him.
"Jack, is something—"
And then they dropped. Whatever happened, Hiccup's cry pulled Jack back to reality, but by then it was too late. Hiccup slipped out of Jack's grasp, and he plummeted right through the ocean of clouds. When he came out of the other side, he got a strong flashback to when Jamie had defied all their expectations by riding Toothless and saving his life. So he wasn't that surprised when Jack shot after him in the same manner, but it didn't do much to calm his panic. When Jack reached him, it was more like he crashed into him than pulled him out of his freefall. Hiccup barely heard him make a strained noise as he grabbed Hiccup's arm and tried pulling him into a sort of embrace, but Hiccup suddenly seemed too heavy. "Hold on!" Jack yelled. His face was scrunched up in concentration, and what looked like a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. The bags under his eyes were heavier than ever. Hiccup managed to grab his shoulder and then swung his other arm around his neck.
"Jack, what—"
he started, but it was hard getting a full sentence out when they were still mostly in freefall. Jack clenched his eyes shut. He hugged Hiccup tightly, and they slowly stopped descending. He huffed. "That's—" he panted. "That's what she meant. Weakness. Not good."
"Weakness?"
Hiccup repeated, his voice a couple of octaves higher than he wanted it to be. Jack's eyes were shining. It didn't matter that the color had changed. Hiccup had seen them like that before. They looked feverish. Hiccup pulled himself up and pressed his forehead against Jack's, but quickly pulled back.
"You're so cold," he said.
"Well, duh," Jack muttered, but sounded too exhausted to reach his usual level of sarcasm.
"No, you're colder now," Hiccup said. "What happened? What's wrong? Jack!"
He yelped when they suddenly dropped again. Jack made a choked sound. "Need to land," he groaned. "Damn heat sprites." Hiccup wondered if he was becoming delirious. He didn't understand what had suddenly come over Jack, but now that he thought about it, and now that everything was between him and an icy swim was a feverish winter spirit, Jack had seemed pretty exhausted ever since they left Glacier Island. "Oh, thank the gods," Jack breathed. Hiccup followed his gaze and saw a small, rocky island protruding from the ocean. It wouldn't be Hiccup's first pick for a date spot, seeming barren of all life, including vegetation, but right now it looked like a paradise. Jack's breathing turned more and more labored as they floated unsteadily on the wind. At several points, they dropped a few meters, and Jack strained himself to regain altitude. Hiccup didn't know what was going on, but he feared it had something to do with the Snow Queen. If she was close when Jack was in this state, obviously there was nothing Hiccup could do to help. As fun as it was flying with Jack, dragon riding was proving to be the safer option. They landed harshly on the ground. Hiccup stumbled and didn't even have to look around before Jack staggered forward on his way to collapsing. He caught him and lowered him to the ground. "Jack!" he hissed. Jack moaned miserably, but managed to look up. "Sorry, didn't see this coming," he panted. He dragged his hand over his face before laying his head back, closing his eyes. His chest was heaving. "Weakness?" Hiccup asked again. Jack tilted his head forward again, opening his eyes. He gave a tired laugh. "Just before I lost my powers, I had a clash-in with something we call heat sprites," he said. "It gave me something of a cold, in a way. My guess is Jack Frost's powers didn't have the time to heal before he was turned into a human." "You don't sound sure," Hiccup commented. Jack shrugged, a sardonic smile on his face. "Not like these things come with a tutorial. My powers are mysterious like that." Hiccup looked him up and down, from his snow-white hair to his bare feet to the frost covering his shoulders, though as he watched that frost seemed to melt, which didn't make any sense since Jack had felt colder than ever. "A cold?" he repeated doubtfully. Jack shrugged. "Or the winter spirit equivalent," he said, and started to fan himself. "Are you hot right now?" "I feel like I'm melting," Jack mumbled, "which, before you ask, is not something that could happen. Just a figure of speech." Hiccup didn't doubt it. "Is it dangerous?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "Just a pain in the ass, with horrible timing," he muttered. "We have to get to Berk." He was right, but Hiccup was not going to take his chances on flying again just yet. "Do you think she might take a few days to regroup?" he asked hopefully. Jack briefly stopped his fanning, frowning thoughtfully. "She seemed pretty beat," he said. "Probably not a few days, but a few hours maybe, if we're lucky." "Okay, well, then we'll just have to take our chances," Hiccup said, worriedly studying the beads gathering on Jack's forehead. "You look like you're about to pass out." "That's what I did the first time," Jack admitted. He sat back and leaned on his arms, letting out a shaky breath. "But it's not as bad as the first time, thankfully." "Seems pretty bad to me," Hiccup said. Jack sent him an apologetic look. "So much for having fun," he said. "Hey, what's fun without a little fear of death?" He realized a moment too late what he just said, and his mouth fell open. Sorry, that's..." But Jack just smiled and shook his head. "Please don't start acting differently around me now that you know the truth," he said. "That was a long time ago. I'm over it." He paused, glancing at the water lapping against the black beach they were sitting on. "Well, mostly over it, anyway." Hiccup looked around. The island they'd landed on was small and gray, with a single hill rising up towards the center. Because of the black sand, he thought it was, or used to be, a volcano. Judging by their luck this far, it would probably explode on them. He turned back to Jack. "Can you start from the beginning?" Jack's face was blank for a moment. "Like the beginning? "Oh, not the whole dying thing," Hiccup clarified. "I mean, I'd love to hear more about your life before Jack Frost, but..." Jack smiled. Hiccup squinted at him. "What?" "Nothing. You just say it with a funny accent. Go on." Hiccup stared at him. It wasn't like Jack was looking at him in a different way than before, but now he knew what those looks had actually meant all along. It made Hiccup's stomach flip and his cheeks burn. "But," he said pointedly, unable to hide his smile, "I think hearing about everything leading up to you and Jamie coming here is the more pressing matter at the moment." Jack looked up at the sky, his mouth twitching nervously. He started. "There's another thing I should tell you about me and Jamie."
What, are you actually not related again? Hiccup asked.
Jack bumped his leg against Hiccup's. We are related, and it's wonderful, he said. But it's not about that. This will probably come as a shock.
Hiccup snorted. Sure, he said.
Jack looked straight at him. Jamie and I are from the future.
Hiccup stared back.
He chewed on the inside of his cheek. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again.
I trust you're not joking right now, he said. I mean, you could just say anything and I'd believe you.
Not joking, Jack confirmed. Around 1,500 years into the future, give or take.
Mm-hmm,
Hiccup said, nodding slowly.
Okay, that's a really long time, even more than 300 years.
Sure is, Jack agreed. He tilted his head to the side and tapped his own temple. How's it going in there?
Hiccup considered it.
He started. Then he suddenly sat forward.
What's the future like?
Jack's face softened, but there was still some apprehension in it. Maybe I shouldn't say, he said, then waved his hands at Hiccup's alarmed expression. Nothing bad. Well, I guess it depends how you look at it. But it's different. Very different. Hiccup frowned, looking at his hands.
Nothing about the vision I saw clued me in that I was looking at the future, he said. I mean, I got it was a different place, but...
That was 300 years ago, Jack said, scratching his head. The world changes faster and faster. It's been a bit disorienting, to be honest. And, look, I could tell you all about the world, at least what it looks like. I've been almost everywhere, at least places that have winters, but...
There are places that don't have winters? Hiccup asked. Wow, that sounds...
He stopped when Jack's eyes narrowed.
Boring, he decided. Wouldn't want to live there.
Jack smiled wryly. Once the Snow Queen is done messing with my reputation, I'll show you my winter is the best season, he promised. Anyway, as I was saying, the future is a long story, and I can't say I like it any better than I like this era anyway. What matters are the people, and people have always been just people. It was strange how Jack, if you didn't count the white hair, just looked like a normal 18-year-old boy, and yet, when he talked like that, Hiccup got a distinct feeling of just how old he actually was. 1 second, his eyes shone with boyish glee. The next, a shadow too old for his young features snuffed that light out. It wasn't just because he was sick either. Hiccup realized he'd seen it in his face several times before.
All right,
Hiccup said, realizing that Jack might not have the energy to explain everything at once. And then there were also the pieces that Hiccup was already putting together. The reason why Jack had been so surprised to see dragons. If he was from the future, Hiccup decided it could remain a faraway mystery for now.
So, I assume the crystals have something to do with it all?
Jack sighed. Very much so, he said. I guess it all started with a dream I had. You know how I said there are parts of my life I don't remember? Well, the dream was a memory, and I decided to follow it. His gaze went distant as he told Hiccup his story. He talked about meeting Jamie outside the cave, which almost derailed him, as he wanted to tell Hiccup about how they came to know each other, but he reeled himself back in and promised Hiccup he'd tell him later. Then he talked about finding the crystal, how compelled he'd felt to touch it, as if it was calling for him. He talked about the monster they'd released, and Jack's description of it made the hairs on Hiccup's neck stand up. Finally, he explained how the monster had attacked the workshop and swallowed him and Jamie whole. The next thing he knew, he'd woken up in Gothi's hut. His eyelids still hung heavy over feverish eyes, but Hiccup could tell he felt relieved to finally talk about this. It seemed to restore his energy a little. As he talked, he'd sometimes gesticulate to visualize the story, and maybe it was Hiccup's imagination, but he thought he saw tiny flakes of snow glimmer faintly between his fingers, like whatever powers hid inside him were clamoring to come out. Less subtly, Jack kept fanning himself like he was sprawled out in the sun on a summer day, and it was hard not to notice the patches of frost spreading on the ground around him. Hiccup couldn't feel the laugh coming before it was out. Jack stopped mid-explanation of how the heat sprites worked.
What? Just, you don't even notice it,
Hiccup said. He leaned forward on his knees and trailed a hand over the frost on the ground. He expected it to feel different from normal frost, but it was exactly the same. He huffed softly and looked up at Jack.
So much of what you did, your behavior and mannerisms that I found strange in the beginning, suddenly makes a lot more sense.
Jack didn't say anything, but kept his eyes on him.
You were just figuring out how to act.
Hiccup hesitated. Human? Jack finished. He smiled faintly, but it was bittersweet. Yeah, it was a strange few days before I started to get used to it again. The not flying thing I learned pretty fast. You can only fall on your ass so many times before getting it. The being visible thing, though. His shoulders sank. That's another thing. They probably won't see me when we get back. There it was again, that old shadow. Hiccup moved closer to him, taking his hand.
See you?
He asked. Jack looked at their hands. Yeah, you didn't see me at first, remember? He said. On Glacier Island, you had to believe in me first.
But that's what Jamie's doing, Hiccup said. Right? That's why you sent him back, wasn't it?
You're so clever when you want to be, Jack said with an amused smile, meeting his eyes again. You're right, but... He struggled with his words before just sighing dejectedly. I'm sure he'll manage to get his friend group to believe, and possibly some of the younger children. But Astrid and the others? He shook his head. Don't worry, though. I knew this would happen. I just wish I could have said goodbye first, somehow. He looked so devastated, Hiccup didn't know what to do. He brushed a thumb over his hand, trying to find something uplifting to say, but all his brain offered was the memory of the two of them sitting near the water together back on Berk, the first time they'd really had a heart-to-heart.
I can't imagine what that must be like, he said quietly. I remember you mentioned something about that before, being invisible. And I said, he grimaced, I don't know, I know how you feel or something like that. I didn't know you literally meant... He trailed off when he saw the amused crinkle in the corners of Jack's eyes. Maybe my experience isn't exactly universal, he said, and squeezed Hiccup's hand. But it still helped talking to you back then. I mean, the circumstances might be different, but we both know what it's like to be outcasts. Hiccup snorted quietly. Outcasts that just happen to be in some position of power, he said. That's two things we have in common. And we both love to fly, Jack supplied, his smile brightening. That day, I'd never felt that kind of solidarity with anyone. I think if I knew myself better, I'd have realized that what I felt back then wasn't... He hesitated, looking bashful when Hiccup raised his brows. The standard issue feeling that you might have for a friend. Hiccup had been about to tease him for being embarrassed, but hearing Jack talk so openly about it, if he could even call it that, was enough to make a foolish smile force its way onto his face. To be fair, I didn't realize before you passed out drunk in my bed, Hiccup murmured. Jack's mouth twitched in embarrassment. Sounds charming, he said, and Hiccup laughed. It was, he agreed, but I think I'm the same as you. It's impossible to meet someone crazy enough to die from a dragon's back without falling a little bit in love. Jack looked like he didn't know where to look. In the end, he smiled like he was holding back a laugh, sighed, and leaned his head against Hiccup's shoulder. He was quiet for so long, Hiccup put a hand on his back, moving it in slow circles. Jack was still cold, but not in the same biting way as before. I spent so long mourning the loss of my powers, Jack murmured, and then when I noticed them coming back, I ignored it. I was suddenly so scared of becoming Jack Frost again. I felt like I was betraying not just myself, but Jamie too. He was never supposed to end up here with me. If I were the guardian I'm supposed to be, He trailed off. Hiccup leaned his face into Jack's hair. I don't know what it's like, he said, but I think anyone in your place would have done the same. Your life as Jackson Overland ended too early and too suddenly. Of course you'd want a second chance. But that's the thing. Jack lifted his head enough to look Hiccup in the eye. Even when I got my memories back and remembered how Jackson Overland ended, Sure, there were moments I wondered what my life would have been if I hadn't died, but I never truly wished it hadn't happened. Maybe I wished I hadn't been alone for so long, but in the end, I found a new place to call home, a new family. But you're right. When I came to know Berk and everyone there, he smiled and put his head back on Hiccup's shoulder. I eventually managed to admit how much I'd missed having a chance at life, like a normal teenager. And eventually a normal adult, but that feels too bizarre to really consider. Hiccup didn't doubt it. He'd only been a teenager for 6 years, and the idea of adulthood was daunting to say the least. And he still had a little more to go. Meanwhile, Jack, how much longer was he going to be a teenager? He decided he wasn't ready to contemplate that yet. And then I came to know you, Jack continued in a quieter voice. And
I guess I was kind of embarrassed to admit even I regretted not having experienced that part.
Hiccup snorted.
You sound like a kid when you talk like that.
And you look like a sunset if I don't, Jack retorted, sitting up with a sly smile. Bright red.
Fair enough,
Hiccup mumbled. Jack's expression softened. Their faces were already so close, so even when Jack moved gingerly, Hiccup didn't feel like he got much of a warning before he kissed him. It was fast and sweet. Jack's lips were cold as the rest of him, but Hiccup didn't mind. He didn't mind at all. You're so warm, Jack commented. Hiccup blinked.
Is it uncomfortable? He asked.
Jack shook his head, his eyes glinting with mirth. His hand was tight around Hiccup's. I wanted to experience the falling in love part of being human, he said. So, thank you for giving me that chance. It felt as if Hiccup was freezing and boiling at the same time. He tried swallowing down the words, knowing they were selfish, but they escaped him anyway.
Please stay.
Jack opened his mouth, and Hiccup knew what he was going to answer.
There might still be a way, Hiccup interrupted. I mean, there's a whole world of magic out there. You even met a goddess, and now you're Jack Frost again. Finding magic should be child's play, right?
Hiccup.
I mean, having a winter spirit as a boyfriend might cause some problems, but I'm sure we can figure it out, he blabbered on. And we've figured everything else out along the way. There's always a way.
He looked at Jack almost pleadingly.
There has to be.
Despite the sadness in Jack's eyes, he still managed to smile. Boyfriend, he repeated, like he was trying out the word.
Well,
Hiccup shifted nervously.
I just thought, but if that's not what you...
No, I like it, Jack reassured him. But I don't think there's a way anymore. I had a hope Freya might give me the chance to remain human while still sending Jamie home, but now I won't age, Hiccup. He averted his eyes, staring at their intertwined fingers. And besides, I'm a guardian. The kids need me, and... He cut himself off, but his gaze moved to Hiccup's leg. His lips quivered like he was trying to get himself to say something.
What?
Hiccup prompted, putting his free hand on the injured leg. It didn't hurt much at all. His limp had been a bit worse lately, but he just blamed it on the cold weather. He'd let himself think that the fairy's curse might not be as bad as the mermaids had made them believe. After all, they had no real reason to trust them. But the way Jack closed his eyes made it clear that wasn't the case. I'm so sorry, Hiccup, he whispered. It's because I introduced you to this world. The other guardians proposed the idea. I hoped you could be the exception, but now... He shook his head, realizing he was rambling. He let go of his staff to hold Hiccup's hand with both of his own. He straightened, his jaw setting in a way Hiccup had learned meant he was bracing himself for something. There is a way to heal you, but you're not going to like it. Hiccup didn't think he was able to handle any more bad news.
I'm guessing there's no way to get around it either, he asked.
Jack's guarded expression wavered. He shook his head. Magic only has power over you when you believe in it, he explained. If you stopped believing in the fairies, it would be like they never even existed. Hiccup's mind flashed back to their last drunken conversation. Nausea began to simmer in his stomach.
But you can't just forget something like that,
he said. As he said it, the words felt more like a prayer than a protest. Not without help, Jack said. But my friend Tooth, her powers channeled through to Baby Tooth. She is the guardian of memory. The silence that followed felt suffocating.
So, in order to heal myself, Hiccup said, I have to forget the fairies.
Jack's expression told him the truth before he put it into words. Not just the fairies. It's all or nothing.
I won't remember you.
Jack looked away. The world felt as if it was tilting sideways, so Hiccup didn't know why he felt the need to stand. But he did, pacing a few steps away before turning around to Jack again.
Don't I get a say in this? He demanded. You've kept this to yourself for how long? It's my memory, isn't it? It's your life, Jack interrupted.
There was an edge to his tone, contrasting the way his voice wavered.
And besides, I don't know what will happen to the future if we influence the past.
That's why Baby Tooth brought it up in the first place. The safest thing to do is to erase it all.
Safest? When have we ever cared about safe?
Hiccup protested.
We could swear to be quiet about it. Other people don't need to know about the future or magic. We'd keep it a secret.
I've thought about all of that, Jack said, getting to his feet as well. I'd even come to terms with it. If everyone could forget except you, at least I know I'd made an impression on your life. I don't want to be forgotten either. Those last words reminded Hiccup of who he was talking to. A boy who'd gone most of his immortal life not remembered by anyone. He immediately felt bad about his outburst, and his anger crumbled. But you're dying, Hiccup, Jack continued. I don't know how long it'll take. Maybe weeks, maybe years, maybe even a lifetime. But you can't take that risk. You know that. Hiccup's breath got stuck in his throat. He knew, but he felt himself shake his head. I don't want to forget, he managed to whisper. Jack came up to him and pulled him close. Hiccup could feel him trembling. Life rarely gives you what you want, he said, in a way that sounded both comforting and bitter. But maybe it gives you what helps you, in the end. Maybe it's better this way. No, Hiccup mumbled, refusing to believe that. He pressed his face into Jack's neck and wrapped his arms around his torso. This time, Jack lowered them to the ground. He brushed a finger over Hiccup's cheek, and Hiccup watched as the tear turned to ice in his hand. Jack's other hand was on Hiccup's neck, his thumb softly stroking his jaw, much like he had the moment Hiccup realized he was in love with him. They were quiet for a long time. I always felt so much joy just being able to touch you, Jack eventually murmured, or even just by meeting your eyes. I thought it applied to everyone, but as we traveled together, I realized it was mostly you. He glanced up at him, looking into Hiccup's eyes as if demonstrating. It blew me away how lucky I was to end up here, with you. Hiccup thought he knew what Jack was doing, but if he meant to cheer him up, he wasn't sure if it was working. Still, he kept quiet, leaning into Jack's touch. Sure, I was pretty miserable at first, Jack said. Confused, scared, overwhelmed. Of course by the dragons, but also by the people. If you don't mind me saying, you are an acquired taste. Hiccup huffed. Can't say I disagree, he mumbled. Jack chuckled. Sometimes it feels like you were the only one capable of being sensible, he said. You are also the first person who made me feel a little safe. I mean, Gothi is a blessing, but she's not exactly... He clicked his tongue thoughtfully. Approachable? The shoes obviously weren't a popular gift, Hiccup said. Jack smiled, wobbled with laughter. I guess I came to appreciate them, he said. They were quiet for a bit. The air felt just a little lighter. I feel like I took way too long to trust you, Hiccup said. At the same time, I feel like it should have taken longer. We'd only recently survived a huge battle, but there's just a feeling surrounding you. Maybe that's what Freya saw. I still can't believe that happened, to be honest, Jack muttered. You and me both. Jack looked absently into the air for a moment. She said she noticed me after a while. I wonder when exactly, he mused. The first time we flew together seems a bit early. It's not necessarily about the two of us, Hiccup said. From the first day, I could already tell how much you love Jamie. Assuming you were brothers was the only thing that made sense. Maybe it's about the three of us, then, Jack suggested. Maybe she noticed when you decided to come with us, with or without my permission. Hiccup smiled slowly. Maybe it was when you stood up to an honest-to-the-gods troll, armed with nothing but a sword you didn't know how to wield because you refused to leave me. Maybe it was when you saved me from Nokken without even knowing what you were up against, Jack retorted, as if it were a competition. Then his expression softened. Maybe it was when you helped me overcome my fear of water. The memory made Hiccup's chest tighten, now that he knew why Jack was so afraid of water. Did it work, though? He asked. Jack shrugged. I'm better now than I was. Maybe if, he faltered, if we had more time. It was a strange sort of pain, accepting the inevitable. Hiccup had begun to pride himself on always, somehow, achieving the impossible. He felt as if he was giving up. But he knew Jack was right. He couldn't choose Jack's memory over his own life. And once he managed to admit that, he decided that there was no point spending the remainder of their time together mourning the lack of it. Looking at Jack, he knew he was thinking the same thing. Jack, he said, The words got stuck just at the tip of his tongue. He wanted to say them, but now he understood why Jack had been so reluctant to open up to anyone in the beginning. Getting something, knowing he would lose it in the end, was it worth it? And was it fair to Jack?
But Jack just smiled. He gently pressed his forehead to Hiccup's. "I know," he said. Jamie, Brand, Anders, Hilda, and a bunch of other kids stood huddled together. They were on the cliff Jamie and Jack used to sit, with the village behind them in the early stages of waking up, the early morning pitch black. Still there was no sign of Jack and Hiccup. Jamie was starting to fear the worst. But standing in front of the gaggle of kids, he kept his chin high.
"So," he said, "any questions?"
Hilda yawned deliberately. Jamie glared at her.
"Is there any way we can fight against the Snow Queen?"
Anders asked.
"Yes," Jamie said. "You need to get other people to believe in Jack Frost."
Anders looked disappointed, gazing longingly at her dagger.
"But believing in the Snow Queen will make her stronger, and we can't get people to believe in Jack Frost without also making them believe in the Snow Queen," Brand said. "And that's bad, isn't it?"
Jamie hesitated.
"It doesn't matter,"
he decided.
"Jack is stronger than her."
"Do you say that just because he's your brother?"
Hilda drawled.
"No,"
Jamie protested.
"You haven't seen what he can do. He can summon lightning."
Some of the kids made oohing sounds. Scotty sat forward.
"Like Thor?"
she whispered. "Like Thor," Toughnut confirmed. Jamie turned to see him and Roughnut coming up to them, and, for some reason, Gobber. When Gobber saw Jamie, he smiled in a way that was strangely smug. "I always knew there was something special about that brother of yours," he said with a booming laugh, and slapped Jamie's back hard enough to make him stumble forward. "Right, so what's the plan?" Jamie stared at him.
You believe me?"
he asked. "Of course I do." Gobber grinned. "I recognize magic when I see it. Always has." "He's always been susceptible to tales like that," Roughnut said, and pointed at Toughnut. "Much like this idiot." "Thank you," Toughnut said proudly. Jamie almost didn't believe it. He laughed and gave Gobber a quick hug.
"That's great. You should talk to others," he said, then gasped. "Do you think you could convince Stoic? If Stoic believes it, then—"
Well, Stoic doesn't even believe in trolls," Gobber said. "But I'll do my best." Jamie gave them a thumbs up as they resolutely headed back to the village. Roughnut and Toughnut might not have the best reputation in the brains department, but maybe Gobber was slightly better. Jamie liked their chances.
"I don't really understand,"
Hilda said. She acted nonchalant, but Jamie could tell she was just as curious about this as the rest of them.
"Why does believing in him help? I mean, doesn't that mean I could just believe anyone has magic powers and they'll get them?"
Jamie stared at her.
"What? No, of course not,"
he said. "How did you even get to that conclusion?"
"For example, if we all believe Hiccup has weird magic dragon powers,"
Hilda elaborated,
"maybe he'll get them. If we're up against the Snow Queen, it seems obvious we need something to oppose her winter magic, like fire."
She paused.
"Maybe he has magic dragon powers? Maybe that's why he has such a way with them."
Toothless made a weary noise.
"Yeah, you and me both, bud."
Both Jamie and Toothless whirled around at Hiccup's voice. He looked exhausted as he limped towards them, but he was unharmed, and there was a smile on his face. Toothless bounded over to him, pushing Hiccup over and offering him an extended wash. Hiccup half-heartedly pushed him away.
"Come on, man," he laughed.
"Hiccup!"
Jamie yelled, catching him in a hug the second Toothless relented, but just as quickly pulled back.
"How did you even get here?"
Hiccup gave a weird laugh. "Perilously," he said. "Oh, come on, it wasn't that bad," Jack said. Jamie shot to his feet. He thought he might have shrieked with joy when he saw the state of Jack. He threw himself at him, and Jack laughed as he caught him and twirled him around in the air. In retrospect, he wondered if Jack and Hiccup had planned this entrance to surprise him.
"You did it!"
Jamie cried when they landed, touching Jack's white hair as if reassuring himself it was real.
"You're Jack Frost! What—"
He cut himself off when Jack's attention moved to something behind Jamie. Jamie turned around to see the other kids staring, wide-eyed and mouths hanging open. Another look, and Jamie realized they weren't staring at him. They were staring at Jack. Jack smiled incredulously. "Hi again," he said. Brand waved uncertainly. Jack turned to Jamie with a huge grin. "You did it too," he told him. Jamie beamed back at him. The euphoria didn't last long. Just then, the sounds of running footsteps came towards them. Astrid, Snotlout, and Fishlegs.
"Hiccup?"
Astrid said, looking alarmed.
"Jamie said you and Jack were at Glacier Island. How did you—"
"We're here,"
Hiccup said apologetically.
"We're okay, though. Sorry to scare you again."
Fishlegs scanned the small crowd of kids.
"Where's Jack?" No one knew how to answer that. Least of all Jack, yet he was the one who first opened his mouth. "Try to figure that one out," he said. He was smiling, but Jamie could tell he was hurt. "I'm gonna try and raise some defenses around the island." Hey, I knew this would happen. The last part was directed at Hiccup, who looked devastated. "Hiccup?" Astrid asked slowly, waving a hand worriedly to get his attention. It didn't work.
"Be careful," Hiccup said weakly. "I'll talk to them."
Then something very surprising happened. Jack walked over to Hiccup and kissed him on the cheek. "Cheer up," he told him. Then he took off, only briefly stopping to pull Snotlout's helmet over his eyes. Snotlout yelped, distracting the others from the way Hiccup's face was turning into an active volcano. Everyone but Jamie, of course. Hiccup met his eyes. Jamie slowly started to grin.
"Shut up,"
Hiccup begged. Jamie dutifully shut up, but didn't stop grinning.
"Okay,"
Hiccup said, turning to Astrid and the others.
"We have some explaining to do."